Oh, right. So, as usual, I found myself with a little bit of time, and I thought I would take this time, do a little bit of a stream, and answer a question that's come up at least once, and I thought it was an interesting challenge. And that is to how do we create in Bolt? How do we create a timer that persists when the scene changes or when maybe the application closes? So you can imagine this as a kind of a mobile style cooldown where somebody might click on something and 3 hours, 4 hours, maybe a couple days later, the cooldown has expired and you can reuse that ability or such things. You can also imagine scenarios in PC games where you might want to switch scenes and the cooldown is still running. You don't want to lose track of that. So that's what I want to take a look at in this stream, and I'll be taking this stream and turning it into a regular video. I'll edit it up a little bit and stick it on the channel as well. So what you can see here in front of you is pretty simple, pretty straightforward. Just got a canvas and this cooldown button. I turned it into a prefab just so I had it. Basically all it is a button. I've taken away the text component, the child, and went out onto the asset store and found some generic RPG like icon to stick on there. So the idea here of what we want to do, right, is this cooldown. In order to do that, we need to know what time the button was pressed or what time the cooldown started. And we need to know the time and the date and all that when it gets pressed. And we need to save that information. And then we can compare the current time data with that saved time. And from using those two pieces of information, we can decide whether, hey, has the cooldown run its course, or is it still on its way? Is it still working its way down, so to speak? So it's actually a fairly simple idea of what we need to do. But in order to get that time and date information, we got to do a few things that aren't necessarily built into Bolt immediately. We're going to have to add in a few variable types. But essentially the idea is we're going to save the time and the date and compare it to the current time and date, and then compare the difference between those two times with the cooldown itself. So to get started here, let's go up here. I've already added these in just to save time. So if you don't know where I'm going here, I'm going up to Tools, Bolt, and then Option, Unit Options Wizard. And this is going to allow us to add more assemblies and or types. So I've added in here the system. I'm not entirely sure that's 100% necessary, but I added it in anyways to the assembly. And then under types, these are definitely needed. We need the date time and the time span. And those are fairly well named. So the date time type, that's going to allow us to keep track of the date and the time. And the time span basically gives us an amount of time between two date times. We'll be using that to compare. So I've already added those in. I'm not going to do it again, waste any time with that. If you're following along, you're going to need to add those into your project, and it will take a little bit of time to make that happen. So the first thing I'm going to do here, I've got my macros folder. I'm going to create a new macro. I'm going to call it Bolt. So Bolt flow macro. And we're going to call this cooldown. Come up to my button, add a flow machine to it, and drag it in like so. So I got a few notes here, so if I'm looking down or whatever, that's what I'm looking at. I got some notes over here, and I got a sheet over on the other screen. So that I can cheat a little bit in case I make a misstep here. There's a kind of a detailed thing we're working on here. Not too bad. So the next thing I need to do here is I need to create some variables. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to create a saved variable. And this is where we're going to save the time that the variable or the button was pushed. So I'm just going to call this skill slot 1. And I guess I'm thinking of this mostly kind of like from a RPG kind of standpoint of some sort of skill slot. I'm gonna add that in, and then I need to choose the type to be date time like so. And there's no inspector there for the date time. That's not a big deal. One of the things I did learn in the process of figuring this out is that the date time types, they get initialized as January 1st in the year 1. Not 2001, but 1, like as in 0001 AD, which is pretty handy for some things we're going to do. It's going to let us shortcut a little bit, save some steps. The next thing we're going to do is we're going to create an object variable here, and I'm going to start with just creating one object variable, and this is going to be the cooldown time. We're going to come back and create another object variable later, and we'll explain why, where and why that's useful. Now my cooldown time, I've chosen to do it in milliseconds. So I'm going to do this at 10,000. So it'd be a 10-second cooldown. Maybe let's make that a little bit bigger, just so we can make it 20,000. The reason I want to make it 20,000 is I want to show you guys that when I go out of play mode and back into play mode, the timer is still progressing, the visuals are still updating, and that's a little bit easier with a 20-second cooldown, just so I don't miss something. Okay, back to our cooldown. I just want to make sure I got my cheat over there so I don't waste anybody's time this evening. So the first thing we got to do here is we're going to respond to a click on this button. So I'm going to pull this up a little bit. We might go to full screen here in a little bit, but for now, we'll leave it like this. Add an on-click event, like so. And then what we want to do, we're going to be creating a super unit to check and see, hey, basically, can we use this cooldown? And we're going to do that immediately. We want to check, as soon as this button is clicked, we want to check and see, hey, can we use this button? And of course, there's lots of ways to do this. This is just the way I have chosen to do it. I'm going to go create a super unit, and I'm going to double click on the super unit to go into it like that. And my graph inspector over here. Okay, sorry. Not working, using my cheat very well. So here in the input, I'm going to click on the input, and what I want to add in here, we're going to have a control input, we're going to have a flow input, so we're going to just have enter, we're going to come in there, and then we're going to have a value input as well. And this is going to be our start time. So we're going to feed in the time that the button was first clicked here, and we're going to choose a type, date time, like so. So this is going to come in, this is the time that the button was first clicked. And again, remember, if the button hasn't been clicked, that date time initiates as January 1st in the year 1. So that's what's gonna feed in here. Then we're gonna do, we're gonna get the current time. So I'm gonna search for date time. Go in there, and there is a ton of stuff. So let's see if we can turn that down. We're gonna get a date time get, and I'm gonna get this date time dot now. And then I'm going to search for date time subtract. Now there's two of these in here, and they look very similar. This first one here, you can notice, I'm going to point at the screen, that's not very helpful. You can see that we've got 2 date times, and then the result is a time span. If I go down, you can see here that I've got a date time span, but the result is a date time. A little bit different. We want this first one here where we're inputting 2 date times and getting a time span out. I'm going to connect up the flow and like that. So we're going to take the current time and subtract the start time. And the result here will be a time span of how long has it been since that timer got started or since this cooldown started. And then I'm going to take this and I'm going to search for time span. It's going to come up. And we're going to search for milliseconds get. I don't want that one. I want total milliseconds. So if you see, there's a difference here. There's the total milliseconds, and then there's this one up here. I missed it. There it is. This one here. This, if you use this first one, you're going to get out a value in milliseconds, but it's only the total milliseconds in that time span. So if it's like 3 days, 5 hours, 2 minutes, 3 seconds, and 500 milliseconds, you're just going to get the 500. Whereas if you go to the total milliseconds, this unit here will give you the entire time span converted into milliseconds. And that's the one I want. Okay, so then we're going to take this and I'm going to compare this. We're going to want to compare this to the object's cooldown time. Let's drag this to come on. We're going to compare this to the cooldown time. Like so. So again, right, we're getting this comparing the time the button was first pressed to the current time, looking at how many milliseconds has passed, or the difference between those, and then we're comparing that to the actual cooldown time. So if this time span, the amount of time that's passed, is greater than the cooldown time, we're good, and we can use this cooldown. So I'm going to add in here a branch like this, and connect the flow, connect the Boolean like that, and then these are going to go to my output. So my output, I'm going to add in 2 control outputs, can use, and I'm going to another one, cannot use. And we're just going to connect it up like that. So what that's going to allow me to do with this super unit is then send the flow in 2 different directions based on whether we can use this the cooldown again, whether the cooldown has expired or is ready to go again. So that is the entirety of our super unit, and we're going to use this in a couple different places. Now, if you've used super units before, I didn't use this super unit as a, it's not external, it's internal to this flow macro. So yeah, it doesn't exist in my project, it only exists here in this flow graph. So I'm then going to connect the flow there, and I'm going to go to my saved variables and drag in my save slot like so. Okay. All right. Here's my cheat over there. Make sure I know what I'm doing. So if we can use this, if we are able to use this cooldown, then we want to set this saved time. We want to save it, set it to this new current time. So I'm going to drag in this skill slot 1, this start time, if you will. I connect it like that. So if we can use it, we're going to save the current time, and I'm going to get the current time with datetime.now get. And I'm going to feed that in there like, yeah. Okay. So this by itself should already be working. This is the bulk of the persistent cooldown. And we can see this sort of, kind of, if I push play. And I know I've been, oh, come on. So I'm actually going to change this. I'm going to change this to, let's change this to 5,000. So it's going to be 5 seconds. Now, if I push this, okay, now if I keep pushing it, you can see that it's not running, it's not running, it's not running, and then it went through. After 5 seconds, it went through again, and I could use the button again. I push it a bunch of times, it goes through once, push it a whole bunch of times, it's not going, it's not going, it's not going, and there it went. So already right now, this is working. It's a little hard to tell because there's no visuals. So that's what I want to add in next. I want to add in some visuals so we can see what's going on. And I'm just going to do the typical, I'm just going to use this image. I'm just going to have it kind of a radial fill. You can see I've already got it set up over here so that as the cooldown runs its course, it's just going to fill up the image like that. Okay. So I'm going to put a box around this. Roll cooldown. That is the bulk of what's going on. And the next piece here is just going to be for the visual. So for this, I'm going to go full screen because we're getting a little bit bigger here. Oh, that's interesting. Haven't seen that before. Oh. Kind of pushing up against some imaginary boundary up there. That's okay. So in this case, what we're gonna do is I'm gonna add an update, because this I want to be updating every single frame, but I only want to be updating this if the cooldown has not expired, has not run its course, meaning we're still filling this image back up. So I'm going to grab this super unit, I'm going to copy it and paste it, bring it down here, and connect it like that. And then I'm going to go to my saved variables, grab my skill slot, drag that in, and feed that in like so. Now in this case, I only want to be doing something if I can't use the cooldown, meaning the visuals need to be working their way around. They need to be showing that it's filling itself back up. Okay. So what I would then want to do is I'm going to take this and that's going to give me some problems. One of the things I might still have a little bit of a beef with Bolt is when you drag things out contextually, it kind of changes what shows up in the search. I don't always love that. So I'm going to do another datetime.subtract, and once again, I'm going to keep the first one. So if we cannot use, we're going to be doing this. We're going to take in this variable here. I'm just make sure I get it in the right slot. We're going to put it in there. And we're going to take the current time and stick it in there. So we're taking the current time and subtracting the start time, and we're getting out the difference between them here, just like we did before. And like I did before, I'm going to take this, drag this down here, and grid a time span, total milliseconds. So that time span, again, the difference between the current time and the time we started, I'm going to turn that into milliseconds. And then I'm going to take that value and divide it by the cooldown time. And what that does, this gives me a fraction here. This is giving me a fraction of what percentage of my cooldown has been completed or has passed. And then all we need to do is we're going to do image fill amount. We're going to set that value. Like so. So again, this is giving me a percentage, and then since the fill amount goes from 0 to 1, this is going to work pretty well. I'm going to put another box around that. Didn't work very well. Box around that. And we'll call this visual updates. Visual update. Okay. Give it a nice. Probably said it a whole bunch of times if you really watch my channel. I really wish the boxes would come in just random colors and not the black. I think it looks a lot nicer. Okay, so let's give this a test. Let's see if this all works. An overview. Push play. And if I click on it, there we go. It's filling up. So you can see it's working. Now, if I go out of play mode and we wait a little bit, we come back in like so. You can see that it's farther along. It's updated itself because it's saving that value. It's saving the time that it would first clicked. So again, right, it's working, it's working. You can imagine the scene gets changed, or maybe the application closes. The user opens the application back up or comes back into the scene, and the cooldown has advanced because, again, we're keeping track of the time. Okay, now that's pretty good. There's a lot of good stuff going on there, but there's one thing here. There's one fly in the ointment, so to speak. And that is, if you have more than one cooldown, there's a problem. And that's because in this flow macro, you are referencing here this saved variable. Now, we're going to have to create a saved variable for every cooldown. I haven't found a way around that. But the other problem, even if we did that, we'd then have to have a different flow macro for each cooldown. And that's just tedious. That's really not good design, because then if you want to change something, you have to change it in all your flow macros. So we're going to be a little bit smarter than that. Now you can see here that on the get variable button here, there's a spot to input a name of your variable. And that's what we're going to do. We're going to create an object variable that stores a name for the saved variable. And then that's the only thing that you have to change. You're still going to have to create a new saved variable, but you can have this as a prefab, drop it in, type in the name of the save slot, and you're good to go. Maybe not the slickest way to do it, but it definitely works. And short of having 100 or 200 cooldowns, it's at least a reasonably viable thing to do. So on my cooldown button, I'm going to add in a new variable here, new object variable. And this is something that actually took me a while to figure out with Bolt. If I want to add an object variable, I can add it here to the variables component, or you can come down to the variables window and click on object. I don't know why that took me so long to figure out, but it did. So I'm going to call it save slot, the plus, and this is going to be a string. Oop, not an integer, string. So I'm going to call this first one skill slot 1, just like what we have. There is lagging, something's not happy. Drag that in there like that and connect it up there. Good. Oh, someone's grumpy. And we're going to duplicate that and so let's check. This should still work. Let's just make sure this is working. Okay, seems to all be working. Okay, that's all working. So there's our prefab here, and let's go up here. Let's override this. Let's save that. And then I'm going to duplicate this, drag it over. I'm going to go grab some other generically cheesy icon there. And now I've got a second one. So here, what I need to do to duplicate this, so if I push play right now, and I push one of them, they're both going because they're both using that same saved slot. So what I'm going to do here on the second button here, on the save slot variable, I'm going to change it to skill slot 2, like that. You notice it highlights a little bit. That's indicating, hey, this is not the value on the prefab. That's okay. I'm going to copy that value, that string, go over my saved variables. And then I'm going to do skill slot 2, also datetime, like that. Okay, let's make sure our object variables are still there. Okay, our skill slot 2. So now what we should have here is they should work independently from each other. If I click on this one, it's working. I click on, all right, let's see what else we have. Oh, okay. So here's my problem. I need to saving to the other time. And again, that's a good, that is a good, right there was a good example of why you want to be using these strings to identify the saved variables. I made a mistake, and if I had multiple flow macros for each of my cooldowns, I would have had to go in and change on each one. But because I'm using the same flow macro for all of my cooldowns, I just need to change it in one place, and we should be working now. There we go, that one fills up, and that one fills up as well. We can shorten up our time. That one's pretty quick. This one's pretty. So there you go. My apologies for the little burp there. I don't know what was going on. That didn't happen in testing. Hasn't happened to me before, so I don't think it's anything to do with what I'm doing. I'm just a little brain fart here with Bolt. But anyways, there you go. That is the flow macro right there for a persistent cooldown. We've got this part here in the blue that's actually doing the logic. It's controlling the cooldown, whether you can use it again. And the part here in red is controlling the visuals of, hey, giving the player some feedback. Then our super unit, if you go into our super unit here, this super unit is essentially just comparing the time the button was first clicked to the current time and saying, hey, is that time bigger than the actual cooldown? If it is, we're going to let you use the button. If not, we're not going to let you use the button. So I hope that was helpful, useful, maybe even interesting for some of you. And until next time, happy game designing.